You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. 2 years into the American Revolutionary War in 1777, British General Sir William Howe initiated the Philadelphia campaign with the aim of taking over the American capital and pushing the rebels towards a peace agreement. That fall, he struck 2 crucial blows against General George Washington and the Continental Army at Brandywine and Germantown and took control of Philadelphia. This forced the Second Continental Congress to move quickly to York, Pennsylvania. For the remainder of the year, Washington stayed out of conflict, choosing to retreat to Valley Forge for the winter, despite Congress's wishes for him to keep fighting. Meanwhile, Washington's colleague, General Horatio Gates, secured significant wins at Saratoga in September and October. Washington faced criticism from some within the Army and Congress for his strategy of avoiding major battles in favor of a longer, attrition-based war against the British. By November, Washington was aware of a strong faction within Congress that wanted to replace him with Gates as the commander-in-chief. The appointment of his critic, General Thomas Conway, as Inspector General of the Army and Gates to the Board of War and Ordnance in December, made Washington believe there was a plot to oust him from command. Over a harsh winter, where his troops were plagued by shortages and diseases that claimed 15% of his forces, Washington fought to maintain both his leadership and keep the army together. He skillfully managed the political battles, portraying himself as a modest leader without ambition, all the while strategically silencing his detractors through his contacts in Congress and the military. Still, doubts about his leadership lingered, and he knew that only success in battle could secure his position firmly. The British, on the other hand, couldn't deliver a knockout blow to the Continental Army and end the American rebellion, despite pouring considerable resources into the fight and thereby weakening their defenses in other parts of their empire. Seeing an opportunity, France entered the fray in February 1778 to support the Americans, leading to an extended conflict with Britain, the Anglo-French War, which lasted until 1783. Spain joined France in 1779, and by 1780, with the Dutch entering the alliance against Britain, the British found themselves diplomatically isolated and stretched thin militarily. Given these escalating challenges and the need to defend more strategic holdings, the British shifted their focus away from North America. They repealed the intolerable acts that had helped spark the rebellion, and in April 1778 attempted to negotiate peace through the Carlisle Peace Commission. In Philadelphia, the new British commander-in-chief, General Sir Henry Clinton, was ordered to send a significant portion of his troops to the West Indies and Florida, consolidate his forces in New York, and assume a defensive stance, marking a strategic pivot in the British approach to the conflict. George Washington's early experiences during the Revolutionary War showed him that relying on a militia wasn't effective. After witnessing his troops disband and suffer a defeat at the Battle of Long Island in 1776, all because of inadequate militia performance, he convinced Congress to establish a professional standing army. Despite efforts to enlist soldiers for the entire war duration from September to December 1776, recruitment fell short. The strict discipline Washington enforced, together with the distance from home and various defeats in 1777, led to widespread desertions and officers quitting. By the time the army camped at Valley Forge, it had a semblance of organization and a group of experienced officers and men, but it was no match for the British Army's tactical expertise. The turning point came with Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben's arrival in March 1778. At Washington's behest, Steuben overhauled the Army's training, instilling a standardized level of discipline and significantly boosting its professionalism, enabling it to stand toe-to-toe with the British. In a significant development on May 21st, General Charles Lee, a seasoned military figure and former British officer who had settled in Virginia before the war, was reintegrated into the Continental Army. Lee, who had been considered a leading candidate to command the army alongside Washington, was captured in 1776 and held for 16 months. Despite his critical views of Washington's tactics and behavior, Washington valued Lee highly, seeing him as a trusted advisor and an outstanding officer. Upon his return, Lee didn't hide his criticisms of Washington or the Army's strategy, but continued to enjoy respect among Congress and Washington's officers. Washington welcomed him back and even appointed him as the division leader in Valley Forge, despite Lee's ongoing critiques and attempts to suggest military reorganizations to Congress that bypassed Washington's authority. Before hearing the news about France joining forces with America, George Washington was trying to decide his next move. He asked his generals for advice on 3 strategies: to attack the British in Philadelphia, to move operations to New York, or to stay defensive at Valley Forge and keep strengthening the army. All 12 generals agreed on the importance of performing well to maintain public support after a tough year. Most of them leaned towards attacking. But Washington, with generals like Steuben, thought the army needed more training at Valley Forge before facing the British. After learning about the alliance with France and noticing increased British movements in Philadelphia, Washington and 10 generals met on May 8th. This time, they all agreed it was best to wait and see what the British would do next. In May, it looked like the British were planning to leave Philadelphia. However, Washington didn't know their exact plans and was worried they might escape through New Jersey. The 2nd New Jersey Regiment had been clashing with British forces and supporters in New Jersey since March, providing valuable intelligence. Thinking a British march through New Jersey was likely, Washington sent reinforcements and teamed up with the skilled New Jersey militia, led by Major General Philemon Dickinson, for better intelligence and to disrupt British movements. On May 18th, the young Marquis de Lafayette, only 20 years old, was given his first big mission to set up a lookout near Philadelphia with 2,200 men. 2 days later, at the Battle of Barron Hill, Lafayette and his troops nearly got caught by the British. Thanks to their discipline, they avoided a disaster. On June 15th, the British forces began their departure from Philadelphia, making their way across the Delaware River into New Jersey. It took a few days, but by the 18th, all troops had crossed over, gathering around the Haddonfield area. The British commander, Clinton, hadn't yet settled on the best route to New York, about 90 miles away. So he split his army into two, one division with around 10,000 men under Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis, and the other led by Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Knyphausen, counting slightly over 9,000 heads. This second group had the hefty load of carrying the army's 1,500-wagon baggage train, slowing them down considerably. Their movement was through intense heat, with temperatures often topping 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This heat wave caused some of the soldiers to suffer from heat exhaustion and slowed their progress, which, interestingly, didn't worry Clinton much. He was quite confident that his well-equipped army could easily outmatch Washington's forces. Moreover, Clinton believed that a prominent battle would make up for having to leave Philadelphia and could potentially strike a significant blow to the revolutionary forces. Both divisions tried to keep to parallel routes for mutual support, with light troops and pioneers opening the way by clearing any obstacles. Despite facing constant harassment from Continental and militia forces, including road blockages and the destruction of bridges and wells, the British's progression remained largely unaffected. By June 24th, Cornwallis's division made it to Allentown, while Knyphausen's reached Imlacetown, just a few miles to the east. From there, Clinton aimed for Sandy Hook, planning for the Royal Navy to transport them to New York. However, the area's road network forced the divisions to merge into a single column to stay within supporting distance. This formation led them towards Monmouth Courthouse. Upon reaching the vicinity of Monmouth Courthouse, the British engaged in constant skirmishes, taking nearly 40 casualties. Knyphausen's division moved to Monmouth Courthouse by the morning of June 26th, and by 10 a.m., the entire column had regrouped there. Facing a gathered and ready Washington's force, and after a taxing 67-mile march, Clinton saw an opportunity for a defensive battle at Monmouth Court. Monmouth County itself was in the throes of a brutal Civil War aspect of the Revolution, with families split between supporting the Patriots or staying loyal to Britain. This internal conflict led to significant damage and personal losses among the population. When the British reached Monmouth Courthouse, they entered a Patriot-controlled town that had been abandoned by many of its residents. Despite Clinton's orders against it, British and Hessian soldiers, along with some loyalists, ravaged the town in frustration and vengeance, looting and burning down Patriot-owned buildings. By the time they left on June 28th, much of the town had been destroyed. On June 17th, when George Washington heard that the British were leaving Philadelphia, he quickly called together his generals for advice, despite most of them, 15 out of 17, warning that the Continental Army wasn't ready for a big battle with the British, with General Lee even saying it would be reckless to fight. Washington decided it was important to follow the British closely. The very next day, Lee's units led the army out of Valley Forge, and by June 22nd, they had crossed the Delaware River into New Jersey. Washington split his forces into two groups, led by Generals Lee and Sterling, with a reserve under Lafayette, aiming to stay close to the British who were near Allentown. By June 24th, at a meeting in the Joseph Stout House, Washington learned from Dickinson that their attempts to slow down the British weren't working. Clinton seemed to be dragging his feet in New Jersey on purpose, possibly hoping to draw the Americans into battle. Another meeting saw all 12 attending officers advising caution. Lee suggested waiting for French support before risking a battle, while others suggested stronger harassment tactics but stopping short of a full battle. In the end, they agreed to send 1,500 men to support the front lines without committing to a full confrontation. This decision disappointed Washington, and Alexander Hamilton, who was there as an aide, remarked sarcastically that the council's caution was excessive. However, directly after this, Wayne, Lafayette, and Greene all approached Washington separately, urging a stronger show of force while still avoiding a large-scale battle. Lafayette mentioned it would be shameful to let the British move through New Jersey without challenge, and Greene highlighted the political need for action and optimism about their chances of success. Motivated by these appeals and eager to overcome past defeats, Washington decided early on June 25th to send an additional 1,000 troops to join the vanguard. His aim was to strike a significant blow against the British, exceeding his previous success at Trenton, yet carefully avoiding a major battle. Initially, General Washington offered General Lee the leading role in the frontline troops, but Lee turned it down, feeling the unit was too small for someone of his high rank. Instead, Washington chose Lafayette for the job, instructing him to attack vigorously if he saw a good chance. However, Lafayette found it tough to fully manage the diverse group under his command. In his eagerness to confront the British, he pushed his soldiers too hard, leading them to exhaustion and leaving them without sufficient supplies. Washington became worried, and on the morning of June 26th, cautioned Lafayette against forcing the troops to march too quickly, concerned about their well-being. By that afternoon, Lafayette had reached Robin's Tavern, just behind where the British had camped the night before, but found himself both too far from the main American forces for support and dealing with worn-out and hungry men. Despite this, Lafayette was keen on fighting and considered a night march to surprise the British by morning. That same evening, Washington decided to have Lafayette leave some troops behind to cover their movements and ordered him towards Englishtown to be closer to supplies and the main army's support. By this time, Lee had a change of heart, seeing Lafayette's force as more substantial than he originally thought and requested to lead it. Washington tasked Lee with leading this force, supplemented by additional brigades, taking over the advanced units from Lafayette. General Greene was assigned to take over Lee's position. By June 27th, Lafayette, now under Lee's command, regrouped with around 4,500 soldiers at Ingleshoff Town, ready and closer to the enemy at Monmouth Court House. Washington stationed the main force, numbering over 7,800 troops and most of the artillery, a bit farther back at Manalapan Bridge. Meanwhile, Morgan's light infantry now bolstered to 800 men, and Dickinson's militia of more than 1,200 men were positioned strategically around Monmouth Courthouse, ready for the confrontation. On a June afternoon in 1780, George Washington met with his senior officers in Englishtown, but didn't lay out a specific battle strategy. After Washington left, Charles Lee, feeling he had the freedom to decide on an attack strategy, gathered his officers for a war council. Lee planned to move once he confirmed the British, led by Clinton, were moving, hoping to catch the British backlines at their weakest. Without any solid information on what Clinton was planning or the lay of the land, Lee didn't commit to a detailed plan. Instead, he told his commanders to be ready to act quickly and to follow his lead. Following orders from Washington received early on June 28th, Lee instructed Colonel William Grayson to lead 700 men ahead to keep an eye on the British movements. If the British moved, Grayson's men were to slow them down, buying time for their own forces to catch up. Grayson and his troops set out from Englishtown at 6 a.m., delayed by an hour due to the new information that Clinton and his forces were already on the move. Both the vanguard and the main army broke camp but faced slow starts. The vanguard got mixed up in their marching order, and the main group was held back by their artillery. Lee personally went ahead at 7 a.m. to scout. A mix-up occurred when a militia rider mistakenly reported that the British were not retreating but prepping for battle. However, Lee found out that the British had started moving at 2 a.m., leaving behind only a small force. Clinton's strategy began by positioning the Queen's Rangers to protect the departure of his 2nd Division from Monmouth Court House. Though planned for an hour later, this move was delayed until 4 a.m. By 5 a.m., the 1st Division was on the move, and by 9:15 a.m., the last of the British troops were heading northeast towards Middletown. The British rear guard, a formidable force made up of light infantry, dragoons, and the Rangers, numbered between 1,550 to 2,000 soldiers, was the last to leave, covering the retreat. Early in the morning, around 8 o'clock a.m., American forces found themselves in a skirmish. The clash involved a small group of Rangers and Dickinson's militia. It happened near a bridge over the Spotswood Middle Brook, A challenging area bordered by marshy wetlands. This bridge, crucial for movement, was on the road connecting Englishtown and Monmouth Courthouse and was a key strategic point due to the difficult terrain around it. Colonel Grayson arrived just in time to help the militia and saw the Rangers pull back. These initial exchanges were happening in an area that was difficult to maneuver around, especially for heavy artillery. Anyone trapped on the wrong side of these ravines or against them would be in serious trouble. When Lee joined Grayson, Dickinson warned him not to move troops across the brook, fearing the British held Monmouth Courthouse in significant numbers. Conflicting intelligence reports about British movements caused Lee to hesitate, wasting precious time. As more troops gathered, Lee decided to replace Grayson with Wayne to lead the vanguard, a force of about 550 men with artillery support. The plan was to advance towards Monmouth Courthouse to engage the British. Lee and Wayne scouted ahead, spotting the British rearguard. Thinking the British force was only about 2,000 strong, Lee devised a plan to outmaneuver them and signaled his optimism about their chances back to Washington. However, things didn't go as planned. As they engaged, it became clear the British numbers were greater than expected. Lee and Lafayette had to adjust their strategy to protect their flanks. Unfortunately, not all units were aware of Lee's plans, leading to confusion. Scott and Maxwell found themselves isolated and decided to adjust their position for better defense. Lee's attempt to encircle the British rearguard failed as he lost control of his vanguard. Reports of British forces regrouping and parts of his own force retreating without orders shocked him. Realizing the numerical disadvantage and losing grip on the situation, Lee prioritized the safety of his command, understanding his original plan was no longer feasible. Upon learning that his rear was under threat, Hillary Clinton promptly instructed Cornwallis to lead the frontline troops back to Monmouth Courthouse, confident that George Washington's forces were too far behind to intervene effectively. He also presumed the challenging landscape would hinder Charles Lee's tactical movements. Clinton aimed to go beyond safeguarding his supplies. He believed he saw a weakness in the enemy's front line and planned to exploit it to possibly overwhelm Lee's troops, something Lee had anticipated with concern. After a brief halt at Monmouth Courthouse, Clinton pushed forward, organizing his elite forces into two main groups, the Guards on one side and the Grenadiers on the other, with the Royal Artillery's firepower supporting them centrally. Dragoons patrolled the perimeter, while the 3rd and 4th Brigade Infantry formed behind, leaving the 5th Brigade in reserve at Monmouth Courthouse. Additional support on the British right flank came from the Queen's Rangers and the rearguard infantry, with a brigade of Hessian Grenadiers positioned as a defensive fallback. Clinton's army totaled around 10,000 troops. On the American side, Charles Lee orchestrated a retreat to a more fortified position about a mile west of Monmouth Courthouse, between Craig's and Kerr's houses, despite facing communication issues and exhausting his aides in the process. By noon, though Lee managed to gather his troops near Kerr's house, his command over them faltered, leading to a disorganized withdrawal. However, thanks to Steuben's training, the retreat was executed with enough discipline to minimize casualties to about a dozen without major infantry clashes, though artillery did see action. Lee considered this withdrawal a strategic move performed with order and precision. Despite maintaining composure initially, Lee's control started to slip, and when asked by Washington's aides for an update, he admitted to being at a loss for words. Crucially, he failed to keep Washington updated on the retreat's progress. Lee then identified a strategic knoll that, if controlled by the British now in line formation, would compromise his position. With limited options and unaware of the main army's location, Lee felt compelled to retreat further across Spotswood Middlebrook Bridge, planning to hold off the British from Perrin's Hill until Washington's forces could reinforce them. Lacking aides, Lee used anyone he could find as messengers to coordinate the retreat. It was during this time he dispatched Army Auditor Major John Clark to inform Washington of the situation, though Washington had already become aware of the retreat from troops who had crossed the ravine earlier. The army had arrived at Englishtown by 10 in the morning, and by midday they were still about 4 miles away from Monmouth Courthouse. Washington, not having heard anything recent from Lee, had no cause for worry initially. Near Tennant's Meeting House, which is about 2 miles east of Englishtown, Washington instructed Greene to take around 550 men and 4 artillery pieces from Brigadier General William Woodford's brigade to cover the right side of the formation. The rest of the forces continued towards Monmouth Courthouse along the main road. However, in just 10 minutes, Washington went from being confident to extremely concerned as he encountered a wandering soldier with news of Lee's retreat, soon followed by entire units withdrawing. The officers Washington met couldn't provide any clarity on their orders or actions. Heading to the front line, he found his front troops retreating without any enemy in sight. By 12:45, Washington caught up with Lee, who was trying to reorganize his forces amid the confusion. Lee, expecting praises for what he thought was a well-managed retreat, was taken aback when Washington bluntly demanded an explanation for the chaos. Recovering from his initial shock, Lee blamed misleading information and insubordination, specifically calling out Scott for retreating without orders. He also reminded Washington that he had been against attacking in the first place. Washington, unconvinced, responded, "All this may be very true, sir, but you ought not to have undertaken it unless you intended to go through with it." Clearly disappointed, Washington set off to manage the battle preparations he believed Lee failed to accomplish, leaving Lee in stunned silence, thinking he was dismissed. As Washington's forces continued to gather and the enemy was less than a half-mile away, he took charge of arranging the defenses Lee had tried to put in place. He tasked Wayne with commanding 3 battalions to secure the rearguard in the point of woods, which would help slow down the British advance. He also stationed the 2nd New Jersey Regiment and 2 smaller Pennsylvanian units on Perrines Hill to overlook the bridge and serve as a rally point for the withdrawing vanguard and where the main army could regroup. Washington gave Lee a pivotal choice: command the rearguard or pull back to organize the major force. Lee chose to stay, vowing to Washington, "I will be the last one to leave the field," as Washington went on to oversee the rest of the army's strategic deployment. Lee set up his forces with 4 cannons and 2 infantry groups on a hillside, aiming to support Wayne from a right-hand vantage point. As the British troops advanced with the guards on their right and grenadiers to their left, they missed spotting Continental soldiers hidden near the point of woods. Wayne's men managed to cause up to 40 British casualties. This action prompted a trained response from the guards, who, backed by some grenadiers and the dragoons, charged at the Americans, quickly sending Wayne's battalions into retreat toward a bridge. Meanwhile, the remaining grenadiers pressed on toward Lee's position, forcing the Continental artillery to pull back to a hedgerow, where 2 infantry units had already fallen back. Lee, witnessing his flanks being overtaken, decided to pull his forces back across the bridge, following Wayne. During this clash, General Washington was busy setting up his main forces on Perrines Hill, to the northwest across the brook from the bridge. As Sterling's division secured the American left flank, their artillery exchanged fire with British troops. Clinton had directed the British 3rd Brigade to cut off the American retreat at the bridge. As the 42nd Royal Highlanders crossed the brook, they stumbled into Scott's retreating forces, pushing them until they reached safety under Sterling's command. Despite some initial progress, British forces, including a 2nd Battalion of Highlanders and the 44th Regiment, were forced to retreat under heavy artillery fire. By 1:30 in the afternoon, Lee was among the last to retreat across the Spotswood Middle Brook, concluding a rearguard action that lasted about half an hour, just enough time for Washington to finish deploying his main forces. When the British Grenadiers pursued Lee's men, they found themselves under heavy artillery fire, which led to the highest-ranking British officer of the day being killed and forced their retreat. Washington skillfully positioned his defense, stretching from the right above the bridge along the Englishtown Road to Perrines Hill. Following the retreat, he sent Lee with reinforcements to form a reserve at Englishtown. The battle then transitioned into a 2-hour artillery standoff. Both sides experienced casualties, more so from the heat than from direct enemy fire. Clinton realized he was at a disadvantage. It was too risky to attack a strong enemy in such intense heat, so he decided to retreat. His immediate concern was to reposition his spread-out forces, especially the 3rd Brigade, Rangers, and light infantry, who were isolated in an orchard north of Spotswood Middle Brook. While the Highlanders from the 42nd Regiment stayed back to cover, the others moved to join forces with the Grenadiers at a hedge. At about 15 minutes to 4 in the afternoon, as this withdrawal was happening, General Greene showed up with Woodford's brigade on Combs Hill, getting a good angle on the British left flank and started firing with artillery. This forced Clinton to pull back his own artillery, ending an exchange of cannon fire with Washington's forces on Perrines Hill and to move his grenadiers to a safer spot at the north end of the hedge. By 4:30 in the afternoon, Washington got wind of the 3rd Brigade's fallback and initiated the first American offensive move after 6 hours of standstill. He sent 2 battalions to test the strength of the enemy's right flank, but only 1 battalion, led by Colonel Joseph Silly and numbering around 350 soldiers, actually engaged in combat. They smartly used the cover of Spotswood Northbrook to attack about 275 to 325 soldiers of the 42nd Regiment in the orchard. Outnumbered and with their comrades already gone, the Highlanders had no choice but to retreat orderly, sustaining minimal losses. While the British saw this as a minor annoyance, the Americans viewed it as a key morale booster, especially since they had faced off against one of the British Army's most respected regiments. As the right flank withdrew, Clinton planned for a controlled general retreat toward Monmouth Courthouse, but confusion among his officers led to a premature pullback, leaving the 1st Grenadier Battalion and the 3rd Brigade vulnerable. Encouraged by Scilly's assault and guessing the British were in a weak spot because their artillery was silent, Washington had Wayne lead a quick assault with the Pennsylvanians. Even though Wayne wanted more men, he went ahead at around 4:45 with 400 troops. They caught a Grenadier Battalion mid-withdrawal. The British, losing men quickly, were soon reinforced, but the American attack fell apart after heavy resistance, retreating to Parsonage Farm. The battle came to an end when American artillery on Combs Hill halted a British counterattack, forcing their withdrawal. Washington wanted to continue fighting the next day, so he ordered 4 brigades back from reserve. They took positions, allowing for further maneuvering near the hedgerow. In the evening, he sent out brigades to cautiously check on the British flanks, but no further engagements happened before dusk. Both armies ended the day within a mile of each other, with the closest British troops at Kerr's house. After the British retreat, some American soldiers looted British dead and nearby abandoned homes, which led Washington to order inspections to prevent looting. While the battle raged, Knyphausen had safely escorted the baggage train, facing only minor harassment. With the baggage secure and no desire to resume combat, Clinton started pulling out his troops at 11 p.m., successfully rejoining with Knyphausen's division by the following morning, without being detected by Washington's frontline forces. On June 29th, George Washington led his army to Englishtown to rest for a day. Meanwhile, the British, feeling confident near Middletown and with a clear path to Sandy Hook, managed to complete their march without much interference. By July 6th, the last of the British troops were boarding naval transports, thanks to the Royal Navy shipping Clinton's army off to New York. This move proved timely, as just 5 days later, on July 11th, a stronger French fleet under Vice Admiral Charles-Henri Hector d'Estaing arrived off Sandy Hook. The outcome of the battle itself didn't really change the bigger picture. Both the Continental Army and the British forces ended up essentially where they would have been if the clash hadn't happened at all. Following the battle, Clinton reported that his forces suffered a total of 358 casualties, 65 killed, 59 succumbed to fatigue, 170 wounded, and 64 went missing. Notably, during the retreat, about a third of the German auxiliaries were so affected by the heat that they couldn't continue, and 256 of them deserted. In Philadelphia on July 6, 1778, it was noted that 440 of these German deserters were among 600 prisoners of war. Despite not listing fatalities among the Germans during the retreat, Washington estimated about 250 British had been killed, a figure later adjusted to just over 300. Considering the typical 18th century ratio of wounded to killed, which is no more than 4 to 1, and assuming up to 160 British were killed by enemy action, it's estimated that the British could have had as many as 640 wounded. A study by the Monmouth County Historical Association puts the total British casualties higher, at 1,134, including 304 dead, 770 wounded, and 60 captured. As for the American side, Washington reported his losses at 370, 69 dead, 161 wounded, and 140 missing. Applying the same casualty ratio and assuming that some of the missing were killed, historians Lender and Stone suggest that American casualties might have exceeded 500. Henry Clinton communicated to Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for the colonies, detailing how he managed to move his army strategically against a stronger opponent. He described how a counterattack was merely a strategy to safeguard their supplies, but admitted privately he had hoped for a decisive win over Washington. Clinton boasted about navigating his troops safely, without losing a single supply wagon, even commending his officers for their skillful retreat from a much larger enemy force. Although some of his officers respected the Continental Army, they were more concerned about France entering the war, which they felt tipped the scales in favor of the Americans. For George Washington, demonstrating his leadership prowess was crucial, especially amid doubts about his role as commander-in-chief. He reported to Congress about the battle on the 1st of July, marking a turning point by highlighting it as a notable victory where the British had to leave behind their battlefield and injured soldiers. This report was met with enthusiasm from Congress, which extended formal gratitude to Washington and his troops for their triumph at Monmouth. Washington's officers, including Alexander Hamilton and Lieutenant Colonel John Laurens, did not hold back in their praise for Washington, reaching out to influential figures to affirm his leadership. The American press and figures like Governor William Livingston of New Jersey, who was not at Monmouth but still penned an eyewitness account, hailed the event as Washington's victory. Despite some skeptics like Samuel Adams and James Lovell, The overall sentiment leaned heavily towards acknowledging the battle's significance and, by extension, Washington's command. In a bold move, defending Washington's leadership, Major General John Cadwalader dueled with Conway, who was perceived as a threat to Washington, resulting in Conway being injured. This act, among others, significantly bolstered Washington's standing. Congress, public opinion, and even those previously critical of Washington started to show him an unprecedented level of respect and admiration, leading to his recognition as the father of his country by year's end, overshadowing his earlier detractors' careers. From the beginning, Lee was portrayed as the antagonist, and this narrative became a key part of the story told by those close to Washington, who didn't hesitate to sing their leader's praises. Despite Lee maintaining his high-ranking position immediately after the battle, the situation could have blown over had he not pressed the matter. On June 30th, Lee, maintaining his innocence to anyone who would listen to him, rashly wrote to Washington. In this letter, Lee blamed troublemakers for turning Washington against him, insisted his retreat was a strategic victory, and accused Washington of treating him unfairly. Instead of the apology Lee was seeking, albeit in an indirect way, Washington called out the letter for being incredibly inappropriate and decided to officially investigate Lee's actions. When Lee, standing his ground, demanded a trial by military court, Washington had him arrested, setting the stage for the trial. The trial began on July 4th, with Lee facing 3 serious accusations: disobeying direct orders to attack, retreating in a manner that was criticized as unnecessary and disgraceful, and showing disrespect towards Washington himself. The trial, filled with heated exchanges, concluded on August 12th, but the drama lasted until Congress confirmed the verdict on December 5th. Lee tried to turn the trial into a personal battle with Washington, even going as far as to label Washington's official battle report as a complete fabrication, while praising his own retreat as tactically brilliant. However, Washington stayed above the fray, while his supporters depicted Lee as a traitor who missed an opportunity to defeat the British, even suggesting Lee had been conspiring against Washington the previous winter. Though the first 2 charges against Lee were debated, his disrespect was undeniable, and opposing Washington was a misstep. Historian John Shai commented, saying an acquittal on the major charges would have essentially signaled a loss of confidence in Washington. Ultimately, Lee was found guilty on all counts, though the court softened the language for his retreat, only describing it as disorderly in certain aspects. Lee's 1-year suspension from the army was viewed by some as almost a nominal punishment, except for the disrespect charge. This verdict effectively ended Lee's military career, eliminating a significant critic and the only real alternative to Washington, further solidifying Washington's position as an absolutely essential leader. Joseph Bilby and Katherine Jenkins have described the battle as a crucial moment when the Continental Army really came into its own. Before this moment, they had only seen success in smaller battles at Trenton and Princeton. Joseph Ellis shares a similar insight, mentioning George Washington's belief that after this battle, the Continental Army was strong enough to stand toe-to-toe with the British professionals on a large-scale, traditional battlefield setting. Mark Lender and Gary Stone provide a bit of a counterpoint. They acknowledge that the training the army received from Steuben definitely improved its capabilities, but they argue that this battle did not really test their ability to fight a large, organized European army in the typical style of the period. In fact, it was the British who undertook most of the offensive actions during the battle. The Continental Army mainly defended their positions, and a significant portion of their forces did not even engage in the main action, staying back on Perrines Hill. The American offensive moves that did happen, like those led by Scilly, were more about small units taking action. The impact of Steuben's training was evident in how the regular soldiers conducted themselves. Half of the troops at Monmouth had joined the army only since the beginning of the year. Most of Lee's forward units were composed on the spot from men from various regiments, lacking any prior unity, yet their performance was solid. They adeptly managed to advance, repel dragoon attacks, handle a strategic retreat well, and successfully attack the Highlanders, all by relying on their training. Washington even praised the artillery for their excellent work. This professional execution of their duties did not go unnoticed. Even the British recognized the Continental's improved performance. Clinton's secretary remarked that the rebels stood much better than ever they did, and Brigadier General Sir William Erskine, having engaged with the American forces, considered the battle a significant British setback, calling it a handsome flogging that the British hadn't experienced before in America. In a twist that shows how politics can shape our understanding of the past, the first reenactment of a particular battle took place in 1828, not just for historical interest, but to boost Andrew Jackson's bid for the presidency. Fast forward to 1854, and a reenactment had to be cancelled due to a heat wave, adding a bit of unintended authenticity to the event. Over time, the harsh realities of the battle faded in public memory, giving way to a more romanticized version filled with heroism and glory, much like the dramatic scenes captured in Emanuel Leutz's painting, Washington rallying the troops at Monmouth. This romantic view was helped along by 19th century historians, who were not shy about adding their own flair to the tale. George Washington Parke Custis, Washington's step-grandson, was particularly noteworthy in this regard, portraying the battle in a light as imaginative as any painting. His and others' writings cemented a negative view of Lee and reshaped the narrative to highlight the role of patriotic citizen soldiers over the actual strategic contributions of the Continental Army. The battlefield itself remained untouched until the mid-19th century, when it started to attract tourists and the landscape around it began to change radically. By the late 19th century, the area had transformed from forests and marshes to orchards and farms. In 1884, the Monmouth Battle Monument was unveiled, commemorating the site of a significant encounter during the battle. In the later years, there was a push towards preserving the battlefield. After some of the land was nearly lost to developers, concerted efforts by state officials, local groups, and historical societies led to the creation of the Monmouth Battlefield State Park in 1963. Officially dedicated in 1978 to mark the battle's bicentennial, the park now spans over 1,800 acres, covering most of the area where the battle took place. Today, the park not only preserves the land, but also helps present a more accurate picture of the battle's history, celebrating the Continental Army's role in the annual reenactments every June. 5 days following a battle, a surgeon caring for the injured shared a story about a patient who talked about his wife. This woman heroically stepped in to operate a cannon after her husband was hurt during the fight. Decades later, 2 veterans from the battle recounted similar acts of bravery from a woman on the battlefield. According to their stories, she either helped by giving out ammunition or by bringing water to the soldiers. Over time, these tales became more colorful and contributed to the legend known as Molly Pitcher. The woman most commonly linked to Molly Pitcher is Mary Ludwig Hayes, whose husband William was part of the Pennsylvania State Artillery. However, it seems that Molly Pitcher's legend might blend the stories of several women who were seen on the battlefield that day. Back in the 18th century, it wasn't rare for camp followers to lend a hand during battles, usually in roles like carrying ammunition and water, rather than actually working the guns. Research in the late 20th century pinpointed the location near Stirling's artillery line of a well from which the legendary Molly supposedly drew water. A historical marker was installed there in 1992 to commemorate this aspect of the tale. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.